Good evening. I'm Michael Barnett from the Elliott School of International Affairs, and it's my distinct pleasure and delight and honor to introduce Dr. Esther Brimmer, who will be providing us the 2015 Shapiro Lecture. I should say that this lecture is actually sponsored by both the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs, and it's also a session of the Distinguished Women in International Affairs series. I just want to warn you that also this event is being live streamed. Is that correct? Okay, yes, the answer is yes. For a web video initiative, and has been open to the members of the media, so I guess that means behave yourselves as things proceed. Just a few words of introduction for Dr. Brimmer. She has been here now. This is her second year at the Elliott School, and I have to say it's been amazing to have been her colleague now for the last 18 months. She comes to us with a distinguished career in both the policy and the academic world. She came to us previously as the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, where she served in the first Obama administration from April 2009 to June 2013. Prior to that, she served as a member of the policy planning staff from 1991 to 2001, and from 1993 to 1995, she was a special assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. In addition to the wealth of policy experience, she also has served in a variety of academic and research capacities. She was a member of the Johns Hopkins SAIS faculty from 2001 to 2009, and she was also, from 1995 to 1999, a senior associate at the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict. And she also has had other stints up on Capitol Hill and even in the private sector. Tonight's topic is one that anybody who studies global governance has to be interested in, because what Dr. Brimmer will be addressing tonight is the area of global governance gaps, technological change, and how it is that we are going to manage the global commons. Innovation and technological change are hallmarks of modern life. Aviation and telecommunications enable people and ideas to cross borders rapidly, yet what we have found over the time is that these technological developments have far outstripped, in many cases, our governance capacities. This has placed a tremendous challenge on both academics and, more importantly, on policymakers to think about how to close those global governance gaps and how to think that we can avoid the pitfalls of uncoordinated life, but also take advantage of the kind of technological developments that are available to us. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brimmer. If you could welcome her. She will speak for approximately 45 minutes. We'll then break for Q&A, and then at 7 o'clock, you're welcome to join us for a reception upstairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out this evening. It's a cold night here in Washington. And also, it's my honor to be giving the Shapiro Lecture for the 2014-2015 academic year, and it's great to see all of you. One of the delightful things about this professorship is designed to bring together academic scholarship and policymaking. And so I'll be talking about issues that have arisen where the two overlap. You also get the opportunity to actually call attention to issues you think are important and where you think there may be open space for further scholarship. So I'll be doing that tonight. And I'll be focusing on one area where I think there's some rapid change, which I say is putting stress on our systems of global governance. There are lots of things going on, and lots of things that many people here in this building are studying, whether we're looking at new actors in international affairs or the press of technology. There's quite a lot to discuss. So tonight I'll be looking at two areas where I'm saying that technological change raises not only technical issues, but also political issues and questions of global governance. I'll look at two very different regimes, but they actually pose some similar issues. One will be unmanned aviation systems, and I'll talk about what those are, and really it has to do with civil aviation and international civil aviation. And the other will be looking at challenges in the internet. Now, one of the questions is say, why now? And one of the reasons is that there's some interesting things happening in the months to come. First off, that in the area of civil aviation, I first got interested in this in last year, and even in the past few months, we've seen new announcements from the Federal Aviation Administration, new moves on the international scene, and even some announcements today, which I'll share with you. So there are actually decisions are going to be made both in our own country and internationally, which will directly affect civil aviation. In other words, policymakers will make choices in the coming months that will set some of the directions in this area of civil aviation. So I think it behooves us as policy scholars to look at those issues. Secondly, the ongoing issues of governance on the internet are extremely important, and there'll be important meetings and issues that will come up this year that always make it interesting to raise, and some, again, important choices that will shape the direction of work on the internet. So whether it's upcoming meetings or the high-level meeting at the General Assembly at the end of the year, there are important things happening in the internet area as well. That said, there will still be issues after 2015. Not everything's going to get solved this year, but I would suggest that there are some important choices that will be made in the coming months. Now, as Professor Barnett has already indicated, technology and social change are fundamental to international life today. Technology and the application of science to tool making is a fundamental feature of modernity. And indeed, the process of globalization is greatly enhanced by the two things we're talking about, civil aviation and communications on the internet. So indeed, the progress of globalization will be affected by the regimes we're looking at tonight. Whether we're looking at the movement of ideas or people and goods, that they'll all be important. So first, let's dig into each of these in depth, and I'll talk about the particular issues and or what I see as the governance challenges related to them. The first is actually overhead, and I'll talk a little bit about what are sometimes called civilian drones, but are also called unmanned aviation systems. Just some pictures to say, what are we talking about? We're actually talking about aircraft that can be of a variety of different sizes. And what's interesting about this is if you were to ask me about international regimes, civil aviation is probably one of the best examples we have of a global technical regime, and that where you have a very clear treaty, an authority which actually governs civil aviation, to which basically all countries participate. Even countries that are not, or entities, political entities that are not formal members of the United Nations General Assembly, participate in the International Civil Aviation Organization. So when you, anytime you get on an aircraft and fly internationally, you're benefiting from, again, this regime of international civil aviation, which has been in this form around for almost half a century, but it goes back even farther than that. The current international civil aviation is governed by what's called the Chicago Convention, which was assigned, as it indicates, in 1944, creating the Convention on International Civil Aviation. Coming out of that ratification was the creation of the International Civil Aviation Organization, which started in 1947. But it actually built on going all the way back to 1919, when you had the first Paris Convention, which was about civil aviation. And as early as 1929, there was a protocol to the then international regime, which talked about pilotless aircraft. The idea that you could fly an aircraft without a pilot is actually pretty old. There were unmanned vehicles in the First World War, and at the time there was already a discussion in 1929 about the importance of contracting states giving their permission for flights by vehicles overhead. The 1944 convention expanded on the 1929 protocol, saying that no aircraft capable of being flown without a pilot shall be flown without a pilot over the territory of the contracting state without the special authorization by that state and in accordance with the terms of such authorization. Each contracting state undertakes to ensure that the flights of such aircraft without a pilot in regions open to civil aircraft shall be controlled as to obviate the danger to civil aircraft. There are two principles there: permission and safety. And that the main conversation is about safety, that the importance of being sure that whatever is in the international airspace is able to comply with safety. So what are we talking about? We're talking about new vehicles entering both national and international airspace. And the question is, how will our current governance regimes manage the use of new vehicles? I'm focusing particularly on the expansion of civilian vehicles. There's been a lot of work, of course, thinking about the role of the use of drones as military aircraft, extremely important. That's a different lecture. What I want to talk about today is what we're seeing is the expansion of the arrival of civilian drones, of civilians being able to use really cool technology. Now, I'll say as a former pilot, I got my pilot's license when I was 20. I'm now no longer current, but that the idea of aviation and the possibilities, I think, is really, really interesting. So what we're talking about is we're talking about powered aircraft. So we're not talking about balloons and gliders. We're not talking about model aircraft, so there's a category of toys and model aircraft that's not covered. Nor are we yet talking about wholly autonomous aircraft that can take off and fly on their own. What we're focusing on is what we call either domestically, we tend to use the term unmanned aircraft systems, but also internationally, you'll see remotely piloted aircraft systems. Remotely, the idea is that you have a person on the ground who is using a device which can communicate with the aircraft while it is in flight. And so that you do have an operator who is actually operating the instrument itself. They can be of a variety of sizes, but much of the focus is on what's called small UAVs, which means under 55 pounds. And there's what's called a micro category, which is under 4.4 pounds. But this gives you a sense, I want to show you some photographs to give you a sense of the size of these. Some of these are the size of a person, some are much smaller. As say, if something is as small as 4.4 pounds, it can be relatively small relative to the traditional aircraft. But both the Federal Aviation Administration and the International Civil Aviation Organization consider these to be aircraft. And so the question is, how do we add something new to an existing regime? And so what we're trying to do internationally is integrate a whole new technology into our existing regime. Now, what's exciting about ICAO, as they say, is when you think about international relations theory, is that this is a global regime, as I said, which focuses on safety, where everybody accepts it. As I say, all countries participate, and entities that are not countries also participate in ICAO. There's a focus on safety, harmonization, and interoperability. And so that, again, you get on an aircraft in one country, you land in another country, you know that everybody is using the same rules. And so interoperability and harmonization is important. And since you might consider civil aviation to be a safety regime, which it centers on the importance of ensuring safety and interoperability, you might contrast that to what you might call a norm regime. In other words, a regime that focuses on certain practices and habits, but which may be creating as a norms and standards, as opposed to focusing particularly on safety. Now, so if we have this, organization set up on one end of the spectrum of focusing on safety, the question is, how are we going to coordinate our standards across these regimes to ensure the continued integrity of the system? Because one of the things about the current international aviation system is the high degree of trust. And we have to commend decades of leaders in civil aviation of creating a system with a high degree of integrity. And so that the idea is you do not want to add aircraft and others that are not able to meet the very high standards we've already set in civil aviation. So the question now is, why is there a push for change? Because what's exciting is that there's a great amount of potentially positive uses for these unmanned types of aircraft. And while you may think about, first of the hobbyist uses, there's a great deal of opportunity for commercial uses. And that's really the frontier of issues here, as to what extent can such vehicles be used, for example, for real estate. And you may have seen that there was a recent waiver to allow for use for filming property from the air. The movie industry is interested in these, as well as the package delivery industry as well. But there's a major effort to try to look at push by the commercial industries to say, we'd like to be able to use these. However, using these for commercial purposes at the moment is banned in the United States. And you can get a waiver from the Federal Aviation Administration in order to fly these. But the great pressure is actually to say, can we make it legal under what terms to fly these aircraft for commercial purposes in the United States? And so there's actually then an effort now to look at how to do that. And there's quite a lot of interest in how you could use these for private use. I mean, even before you get to the commercial use, there's a lot of public use. Some of the people who like to use these, for example, are the Fish and Wildlife Service. If you are monitoring wild animals, if you are looking at disaster relief, if you're looking at storms, if you're looking at if you're inspecting large structures such as bridges and other things, there are lots of uses where it's relatively unsafe to send a person, but you can send one of these. So already there's quite a lot of interest from the public institutions that are non-military for use of these instruments, and then we add the greater interest from the commercial community as well. But the question is, why is this technological change such a challenge? Well, first thing, there's no pilot on board. And the central portion of safety has been the judgment of the pilot. Whether you're sitting with your buddy, the private pilot, or getting on a commercial airliner, the ultimate safety rests on the judgment of the pilot. And so even a commercial pilot, it can always make choices for the safety of that aircraft. And therefore, the entire system of air traffic control assumes that you are working with a person who's with the vehicle and is able to communicate with a tower, is able to communicate with other aircraft, and is able to be responsible ultimately for the see and avoid or detect and avoid aspects. In other words, being able to respond to instructions to be able to make sure that you are operating the vehicle safely enough not to run into somebody else. Back to the central area of safety. And the challenge now is if you are no longer in the aircraft, how do you provide for that type of safety? And at this stage, the detection capabilities do not provide the same input as a pilot. You also need constant secure communications, and you need to be sure that you know where everybody else is. Also, the question was what did you have to know in order to operate these vehicles? They are small. They can be very lightweight. They can get very close to people. And as of now, you do not need to have the same education as a pilot. As someone back when I did my pilot's degree was struggling through learning all the uses of the airspace, well, the first question was, can you fly something of this size without having some of the knowledge of the air traffic control that you're required to as a pilot? Also, they're relatively inexpensive, and they're widely produced. So a few years ago, the European Union estimated that there were at least 500 manufacturers worldwide, 1,000 operators in Europe alone. In other words, this technology is diffusing rapidly. And so there are very practical issues about how you think about airworthiness of these aircraft, pilot certification, air traffic control. All of these issues are important domestically, and they are important internationally as well. Now, since I work on international organizations, there's always lots of acronyms. So the next couple of slides will give you the acronyms. So you say, which one is she talking about? So what's really exciting is that, as I said, recognizing that there was going to be a question about how are you going to introduce these new vehicles into the civil aviation airspace, interestingly enough, we have brand new statements from the Federal Aviation Administration. No, they were not timed for the speech, but I was really glad that they actually came out. I thought they were working on them. That the Federal Aviation Administration has just announced the new set of regulations that were expected to come out later this year, and they've just announced them. The 2012 Federal Aviation Modernization and Reform Act had required that the FAA come up with a new plan for integrating these aircraft into civil aviation. Well, they're a bit ahead of schedule, and they've announced and is now currently open for comment. So you can go to the FAA webpage and have a look at this for comment about the new rules for use of these aircraft in the U.S. airspace. And I think how they did it was also interesting for us because that you had two statements that came out. One statement from the FAA about safety, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then the second one from the White House on the policy and privacy issues that are also related. And so the new statement from this also was to talk about how to integrate these devices and to talk about the continued work in this area. So that in addition to the changes I'm about to share with you, that the FAA has also set up 6 test sites around the country that are actually testing these vehicles. So the photographs earlier were actually from one of the test sites at the University of Texas, Corpus Christi. And that's one of their UAVs that you saw there, and the two gentlemen standing there were from the University of Texas with that system. But what's really cool is that, as I just said, one of the concerns is detect and avoid. How can you make sure that you're not flying into somebody else? Well, one of the things they're doing at the test site is looking at this. So announcement today from the University of Texas at Corpus Christi was about their new a new experiment to look at a new detect and avoid system that would actually make it easier to detect other aircraft from a civilian drone. So even as we're looking at this, there's sort of innovations on a regular basis. But so what does the FAA say? So the FAA is proposing that to define unmanned aviation systems as less than 55 pounds, they have to travel less than 100 miles per hour. Now, I'll tell you, back when I used to fly Cessnas, that was about as fast as we could go. But, and that they can only be up to 500 feet off the ground, and they must fly with a minimum visibility of about 3 miles. It sounds a lot like visual flight rules. If you're a visual flight rules pilot, in other words, you fly without instruments, it was very similar types of rules. And the pilots are considered operators. They must. The idea is they would have to pass an FAA knowledge test and screening by the TSA, which, as you may recall, given that one of these things landed on the White House lawn, has taken a new interest in who is actually flying these particular vehicles. So we're seeing that on the technical side, the Federal Aviation Administration is coming out with some new proposals about how these might operate in the airspace of the United States. But also, as I mentioned, in addition to the safety side, was the very interesting policy statement that came from the White House, because the other issue related to these is privacy. Because once you have a vehicle up in the air, it can, of course, see not only what it may be focusing on, let's say real estate, but everything else around it. And so then the question was, how do we protect privacy and civil liberties while advancing the technology that they can benefit from this particular technology? And indeed, I talked about the importance of the civil uses and public uses of this particular technology. And indeed, in 2013, the FBI, for example, admitted that it had used the unmanned aerial systems for surveillance without a warrant. And as you can imagine, this occasioned quite a deal of interest both on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. We had at least one senator hold up 2 nominations over this issue. And so one of the important other drivers in terms of thinking about these types of vehicles is how do you protect human rights and privacy in addition to advancing the ability to use these for commercial and other interests. And so I think that this model of having both the technical agency talk about safety and then the policy side, a policy declaration, is a model that we're going to see and probably need in more than one place. But not only is there efforts here, there are also efforts internationally to try to harmonize the different plans for unmanned aerial vehicles. Just by way of comparison, our colleagues in Canada have also issued their own standards. Now, you think of our North American airspace is deeply integrated, but even amongst countries as close as the United States and Canada, there are differences between them about the immediate rules. For the micro drones, that, for example, the U.S. says you can fly these up to 400 feet for little tiny ones. Canada says you can fly them up to 300 feet. If you are in Canada, you need to go to ground school to fly these. If you're in the U.S., you can self-certify to fly the smaller ones. If you're in Canada, you need $100,000 Canadian dollars in insurance. Similarly, in the European Union, there are differences amongst the European Union countries, although they share airspace governed by the European Aviation Safety Agency. So there's clearly a need to try to harmonize the standards within countries. And so that's where the International Civil Aviation Organization comes in. And it, too, is considering new guidelines. And so, again, as I started looking at this, I found that actually ICAO itself is also looking at issuing new guidelines on this in the very, very near future, which would try to address some of these questions related to both technical safety, but then the question is, how do they handle the other issues? Now, the ICAO, I'd say, is set up to handle the technical side. They've looked at, over the past decade, they've expanded their work on trying to understand how to integrate these new remotely piloted aviation systems. The member states have extended the remit to ICAO to look at these issues, and they've already issued some standards on aviation marking, so you know where these aircraft come from. But now ICAO will be looking at further efforts to harmonize the technical standards between countries and to improve communications, because there again you need to be able to communicate with these aircraft while they're in flight and while they're in flight internationally. There are also bodies such as the Joint Authorities for Rulemaking on Unmanned Systems, which brings together the aviation authorities of several countries that are contributing to this debate. And so you're seeing, in this case, a highly centralized system. As I say, we have a single regime which has one single international organization in which member states participate with important input of both companies and experts, but it's a single system. That contrasts quite markedly to what we'll see in a moment in the internet system. But I'll just recall that, again, with the aviation system, we have a new technology. We're trying to introduce a new technology into an existing regime, which is a highly centralized regime and which is based on safety. And at this stage, the question is how to do it, but there isn't a challenge to the actual question of who should be making the rulemaking. We also have the advantage that it's probably, I would suggest, often easier to deal with a technology when it is new. And that's often the easiest time when people are still figuring out what the rules should be, as opposed to when technology is already well underway. So I will contrast this initially to some of what's going on in the internet regime, but suggest there are actually some similar elements. One to keep in mind is the role of some of the agencies when you ask who's actually involved. That in addition to the technical requirements that I mentioned a moment ago, that also as part of the policy statement on unmanned aerial vehicles, there's supposed to be a new discussion group set up within the U.S. government to look at the privacy issues. That will actually be managed by an agency at the Department of Commerce, NTIA, which produces the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which is central on the internet issues, is actually going to be the agency that's also going to look at the privacy issues related to civilian drones, because that is actually one of their areas of specialty. So indeed, some of the same people are worrying about these two very different issues. Now, let's look at, if we look at having looked at the overhead part, let's look at the online part and some of the challenges also coming up in internet governance, and then see how these are also pushing and pressing our global governance structures. Now, again, there are a lot of acronyms. I'll just put up a couple in the slides. That, as you know, that the development of the internet included both the work of the Department of Defense, DARPA, and working with the University of Southern California to develop, among other things, the naming system. And so when we look at the different functions in managing the internet, one of them is actually this question of how you actually manage the names, the domain names that go with internet addresses. So we don't each actually have one of those long numbers, that we actually have a domain name. Now, to fast forward a lot of internet history, just to say that relevant for our conversation now is that currently domain names are managed on a contract from the Department of Commerce and TIA to a very interesting entity, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, has a contract to manage those particular name systems. And one of the big changes that's happening this year, and one of the reasons it's interesting to look at internet this year, is this is changing. That after the memorandum of understanding under which the contract is running, which has been operating with the United States government since 1998, will transition this year. The Department of Commerce has announced that it will develop a new system for managing domain names, and that it would aim to do so by September 30th, when its current contract with ICANN is up for our renewal. So this opens up a moment of change in the governance of an aspect of the internet. This is part of what has been a 16-year process to transition the management of names from a U.S. government structure to a private entity. So you may see it as the next step, or you may see it as actually creating a new regime. Now, just to explain that there's several different sets of functions, to say that among the functions that relate to naming, includes being a repository for the actual domain names, and also for managing the regional allocation of the different names. There are a variety of other functions, but things to keep in mind. This is the assignment of names, and in a sense, the agreement for interoperability, the equivalent of harmonization, so that everyone who participates in the internet agrees on what your address is so that your emails get where you're sending them. It's the core of the technical interaction on the internet. It is now managed with input from key different stakeholders, including the Internet service providers and the Internet Engineering Task Force, and others are part of this delicate mechanism for managing the actual domain name issues. This transition plan, when the Department of Commerce said to ICANN, we'd like to develop a transition, the Department of Commerce laid out quite a set of some very specific elements that they wanted to have in a new system, reflecting elements that have been a longstanding U.S. government position, including supporting the multi-stakeholder model, in other words, having several different types of entities which are currently involved, which include governments, foundations, academic experts, business, and others who are part of the multi-stakeholder model in managing this relationship. The Department of Commerce also talked about the importance of maintaining the resiliency of the internet, but they also said that they did not want to see an intergovernmental organization take over these particular roles. And so there's quite a lot of the debate centers on what will be this future structure for managing the domain names. The challenge here is that many of the structures we're looking at are owned by private entities, as compared to the previous case when we were looking at civil aviation, where airspace is actually owned nationally and is part of a global commons. So some of the pending issues now, from the U.S. government point of view, has to do with this transition to these functions of managing these domain names. But that's not the only issue on the international agenda. And this is where I think there's a case for greater input from scholars of international politics with scholars of internet transition, because I think the two may be working on parallel and not complementary efforts. Because in addition to this question of the transition of domain names, there's also other issues that other countries care about that are also part of the debate about the future of the internet. One of the most important is digital access. There are about 7.2 billion people in the world. About 3 billion people have access to the internet, according to the Internet Society. If you were to look regionally, the most amount of internet users are in Asia, not surprisingly, about 1.3 billion users are in Asia. In North America, there are about 310 million users, and you think that's almost the whole population, you'd be right. Because if you were to step back and think about the uses and access to the internet, you'd say worldwide, only about 42% of the world's population has access to the internet. Now, in North America, we have about 90% of the population has access to the internet. In Australia, Oceania, according to the Internet Society, about 73% have access, about 71% in Europe, about 52% in Latin America, 48% in the Middle East, about 35% in Asia, about 20% in Africa. So for many, many people and many, many countries and many, many governments, the issue is digital access. It's just getting connected in the first place. And that is a major priority issue. The role of internet access for economic development is coming up not only in the internet issues, but in the debate about Millennium Development Goals. And as many of you work on international relations know, there's been a major multi-year effort by governments who will come together this year to rethink the development goals that have been under the Millennium Development Framework, and to rethink sustainable development under the sustainable development process from Rio Plus 20. In other words, there's a global conversation going on about development, which is going to include the internet issues. All of them are going to get discussed together in New York at the end of the year. So when you're thinking about internet governance, you have to also think about what's on the agenda of the world at large, and access is part of it as well. And so here we have a system which is, in a sense, the opposite of civil aviation. It is actually highly decentralized with many different players. But the question is what role are governments going to play? Because many different governments want to have an influence on this topic, but they're coming from very different aspects. Now, if we look at the international global structures, again, completely different from civil aviation. Here you have many, many different entities, including, most importantly, the multi-stakeholder model, which includes, as say, a variety of actors, including private sector actors, working on what are usually voluntary arrangements to deal with specific problems in internet governance. But you're seeing that governments over the past 10 years have also met to try to grapple with what's the role of for governments in the information society. Frameworks include, again, more acronyms. The WSIS, World Summit on the Information Society, which was met twice, first in 2003 in Geneva, creating the Geneva Plan of Action and several action lines out of that, and in Tunis in 2005, where member states defined Internet governance as saying, quote, a working definition of Internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their own respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution of the use of the Internet. And many people like to refer to that particular definition of Internet governance, which includes many different actors. But for someone who spends a lot of time, you spend a lot of time worrying about international organizations' documents, you've got to read the other clauses as well. So you go to, that was Article 34. Article 35 went on to say, we affirm that the management of the Internet encompasses both technical and public policy issues and should involve all stakeholders and relevant intergovernment and international organizations. So on one hand, you have the international community talking about the role of the larger community and also talking about the role of governments and international organizations. Well, this year, there's also a series of other meetings, including the Internet Governance Forum, which was also set up by the same process, which brings together many different actors to look at the Internet. But then there's also a question of the role of the International Telecommunications Union, a major international organization that works, as the name suggests, on telecommunications issues, including everything from radio band usage, including radio band usage for aviation, and for cell phone usage as well. And so some of the concerns you hear is the tension between those who support a multi-stakeholder view and those who want to have a larger role for governments. And one of the fears is that by people who support the multi-stakeholder view is that the arrival of governments will bring a concern not only with safety and security, but also with content. And what you see is a concern that more authoritarian governments will use the discussion of internet governance to try to control content as well as dealing with safety and security. And I found one of my frustrations of looking at this issue is a sense that too often I think that we're often talking past each other when looking at these issues. And it seems to me that one of the contributions that we can do as public policy scholars is to look at, are there ways of thinking about international organizations that can help us when we're thinking about issues like the internet issues. And I suggest that maybe stepping back and saying, what are we trying to do? What are the tasks we're trying to do to help inform the conversation about the future of the internet? So it seems to me you can actually identify at least 6 tasks we're trying to do in internet governance. One of them is to manage addresses and interoperability. As I said, the technical issue that now falls under the IANA functions, but which has to do with actually making sure that the connections continue to work, and it's based on the sound cooperation of the technical experts and the very effective process now for making sure we manage names and numbers. But we also have to safeguard the physical network. The physical network is in some cases in private hands, in other cases in public hands, but there's a question literally of making sure that that it is well safeguarded. And indeed, if you're a reader of Foreign Affairs, you will have seen in this month's issue an article which comments and particularly on the fact that 95% of our communications go undersea. In Robert Martingale's article, he points out that if you have 95% of our telecommunications run in undersea cables, and so that most of which are literally buried, but every now and then, earthquakes, deep trawling, deep sea mining, that they actually are interrupted. So there's actually an element of actually safeguarding the physical network in terms of making the system actually work. There's also the question of assuring security, accountability, and authenticity. This is where it starts getting a bit dicey. On one hand, you want to know to whom you're giving your credit card number. You want to be sure that there's some method and recourse for dealing with the interaction with others across the internet. But you also want to be sure that your ability to know who has your data doesn't spill into governments figuring out who is sending emails discussing dissent and political issues. How do you make sure that you are able both to provide for security, accountability, and authenticity while also protecting content? So this is where it starts getting more difficult, but that's one of the most important but most difficult issues. But security is extremely important. Again, if you saw recently that one of many examples of the challenges of security on the internet, that we just had yet another criminal ring use really sophisticated malware to enter into bank system and steal millions of dollars going via the bank's own systems. So there's a real need for security and authenticity and accountability on the online. The fourth issue is what it calls is enhancing digital access. As I remember, the other 3.5 billion people who would like to have greater access, and they're not all in the developing world. I mean, we may have 90% access in this country, but there are a lot of people who don't have digital access, and you don't have to go that far in this city for that to be the case. So the question of enhancing digital access, making it more possible for people to benefit from the internet is another important job, what we're trying to do. And finally, we're trying to make sure that we're also protect being a human being and your human rights online, in cyberspace, just as you do in real space. So it seems to me all of these are real jobs that we're trying to do in internet governance. And it seems to me that there are different levels of government participation. Because it strikes me on one hand, well, that the best way, if you really want to protect the multi-stakeholder model, is to understand where should be the role of governments. Because I will argue governments will be involved. Governments want to be involved, and on some issues, they have to be involved. And the question is where and how and under what circumstances. And I would suggest that if you were to take these tasks apart, the first task, that you would want to preserve as much of the current multi-stakeholder system that works well in managing these names and numbers. But interoperability does have an international component and a standard-setting component. It does in civil aviation. It does in the internet as well. And the question is how to preserve what we have now in the transition that's coming about how we manage names and numbers, to preserve the integrity of the system while making sure it still works, but recognizing that you need to have a seamless transition. Safeguarding the physical network. That will be important roles for companies in the private sector, but there will be an element of government as well, because there'll probably be a law enforcement element for those who may then physically damage the aspects of the network. There'll be an element for Coast Guards and Navies as well in safeguarding the physical network, in addition to the responsibilities of the private sector. In terms of dealing with the security and accountability, as I say, that's probably the most difficult issue and probably where I think we probably need to do the most work. But there again, there'll probably be some law enforcement element to it. I would suggest that the biggest role and most important roles for governments and international organizations are 4 and 5. Enhancing digital access and ease of access. And there's interesting work going on looking at how you make internet services run well all around the world, and make internet speeds as fast as possible for everywhere. Those are important policy issues. Questions of equity, questions of access. Those are policy issues where it's reasonable to have public policy entities involved. The question is how to do it. And then the question of protecting human rights online. That, I think, is central. And I think many colleagues have been working for quite some time to look at how you support freedom of expression, free exchange of ideas, which we value online. Though there's a role both there for governments to try to protect that. The challenge is to make sure that you also are going to defend against governments which may try to interfere with that. But you're probably going to need governments to help protect against encroachments by authoritarian governments. So it seems to me that here in these government issues, we have the question of we have more actors, more who want to be part of this question of who decides. But I think trying to ask what are the different types of jobs we want to do and who should be the right entities may help us think about next steps in internet governance. And I would suggest that it also links back to what we think about when we worry about global international order generally. I mean, many of these issues that come up here follow the same politics of lots of other issues, where we're seeing the importance of emerging powers and new powers that also want to have a say in internet governance. We've seen the traditional dominance of the United States in managing internet governance. Now the question is how to share that further and across a wider scope of governments. But I would suggest that one way to do is the actual old-fashioned diplomatic tools. And here, this is again where I think there's places for intersections and cooperation be amongst those who work on these specific technical regimes and people who do traditional diplomacy. Because some of the politics on the internet have, yet again, the United States and the European Union and the advanced developed countries who are supporting liberal democracy and more authoritarian governments, and in the middle, swing states, countries that are also emerging powers on lots of other issues that are also playing a role here as well. And I would include Brazil and India in this category. The debates and the diplomatic conversations with emerging powers will be important in these issues, including on the internet issues as well. And so I'd say there's a real scope here for what we do here in places like the Elliott School, which is bringing together people who know about international politics, who know about the technical issues, who know about global governance, to try to think together about what are the roles for governments, what are the roles for the private sector, how do we not only continue the interoperability and harmonization of our systems, whether it's civil aviation or the internet, but that we also figure out how we manage issues of privacy, access, fairness, and equity. Those are policy issues. And it seems to me the next steps in both of the regimes, the ways to bridge the gaps in both regimes, is to try to bring together more of that interdisciplinary types of work to try to address these questions in particular. Many people around this building are trying to think about what will be the next curriculum that might try to do this. But I would just say that all this is going to keep moving forward. Whether it's the next question of what we're going to be doing on the internet, whether it's the next stages for civil aviation. I mean, we were just talking about unmanned aircraft. Well, at some point, those aircraft will be providing your Wi-Fi. They'll be flying high enough eventually to be being closer to being satellites than to being aircraft. There may be a time when they're carrying passengers. These questions will continue to evolve, and it seems to me that the foreign policy community and the technical community together need to be part of solving them in the future. Thank you.
We've got a few minutes for questions. If I could steal the prerogative, though, and ask the first, can you give us a sense of the divisions globally? You mentioned a little bit about, in terms of internet governance, how they might line up. We've got China, the United States. You've been working a lot on emerging powers like Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa. How do their interests line up? And so where can you see their possibility for real cooperation as opposed to where you think the stumbling blocks are?
All right, certainly, thank you. Indeed, it's quite interesting, as I say, that you're seeing some parallels here to some of the issues we're seeing in other parts of the questions of international order. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, that the current internet system with its multi-stakeholder model has been underpinned by the important role played by the U.S. government in terms of providing the contract for supporting the allocations of names and numbers. That said, you had an important role for a Western country. You had many similar views about both the nature of the internet itself, but also the importance of freedom of access, freedom of expression, of the separating content from the technical issues shared by many of the Western countries. And so you had the United States, the European Union taking very similar views towards internet access issues. You've had many of the authoritarian states, whether it's Iran, which of course runs its own internal system, China, which of course has a very well-known restrictions on its population's access to the internet, which have taken, especially in the international bodies, a view of wanting to have more mechanisms for state control of the internet. In between, you've had many of the emerging powers, which talk about freedom of expression at home, many of which are liberal democracies, many of which may also have companies that are involved in commercial interests as well, which one would think might also work with the countries that support human rights, freedom of expression, offline and online. So you would think that would be the case. What we saw, though, is that that's very much an open question. That's why I think countries like Brazil are really interesting in this particular debate. So you had this, I'd say, many years of discussion about what were going to be the role for governments and how are you going to protect the current multi-stakeholder model. That was already stirring when we had the 2013 issues with surveillance. And so the questions of electronic surveillance by governments began to then overlay the already existing separate conversation about internet access. And so those became conflated. And so you saw that initially some of a setback in terms of the conversation amongst states, because not surprisingly, the question of the surveillance by the National Security Agency then became to a question of would that also, was the internet work actually facilitating that surveillance. The idea is you're actually supposed to be two separate systems, but clearly the surveillance was facilitated by greater internet access. That said, it then meant that you saw the conversation between the United States and Brazil completely break down at that point. But I would credit a great deal of work since then to try to restore a discussion on the importance of the multi-stakeholder model. And indeed, Brazil then ended up playing a leading role. That from the fall of 2013, when you saw a lot of acrimonious discussion, you saw the state visit canceled from the Brazilian president to the United States. 6 months later, Brazil hosts something called Net Mundial, which was an important conference in Sao Paulo of internet experts, of governments, international organizations, and others to try to look at next steps on the internet, and a very important statement of thinking together about next steps on the internet, signed by Brazil, Europeans, Americans, others, was signed at that event. That's now evolved. That was taken up at Davos this year. And so you see that the emerging powers can be playing pivotal conversations on this, but I think that dialogue needs to continue. And that's where people who are working on emerging powers and people who are working on internet actually, I think, can contribute together, because I think it's important that those of us in the United States and elsewhere understand what other countries are looking for and what they care about. And it seems to be one of the areas. I mean, one of the areas is a question of how you have more input to the governance structure. But the other area, I think, is this digital access, that for many of the emerging powers, while they're both interested in state sovereignty, they're also interested in greater access and are interested in development. And that's why Brazil is interesting, again, because the host of the Rio Plus 20 Sustainable Development Debate, and they're important players on the United Nations Sustainable Development issues, that there's, again, a confluence of interest, I think, perhaps around greater digital access, because ultimately, for many of these governments, they're trying to figure out how do they provide greater access for their people. Hello. I'm sorry, could you introduce yourself? I think there's a microphone coming so I can hear you.
George D'Angelo from CSI, Conflict Solutions International. I have a question about ICANN and the other entity that governs registration of names on the web. Did you say that it's going to remain an American entity?
No, it's supposed to be, we will see, it's supposed to be in transition. As you know, that the Department of Commerce, NTIA, announced that last year, it was almost a year ago, in March 2014, that they would transition to a new entity. And the idea is we're now waiting to see what that new entity looks like and what elements. When they announced it, they said what they would like it to look like. Now, others will have their own views about what they would like it to look like. So we're waiting to see what that new structure will look like. The current contract ends September 30th. And so it will probably be before then. Theoretically, they could renew it if they haven't worked it out yet. But the idea is it's supposed to transition to some new form. The question is going to be, what is that going to look like, and who's actually going to be part of that?
So we don't know yet, but it may be an international organization, or
it may be some other entity. I would think it will probably not be a classic international organization with a headquarters and a secretariat the way we think of other international organizations. I would think it's probably going to look like a structure which would have probably some non-governmental elements in that. We don't know yet. It actually, I think, maybe look the way more organizations are looking now. We classically had lots of international organizations with formal headquarters and secretariats. Increasingly, we're seeing more informal organizations that take on responsibilities, but have private sector and other entities involved. And a couple of examples. So if we think about in other fields, if we look at climate change, and we look at the efforts to deal with certain gases, Montreal Protocol, private sector, public sector, and NGOs involved in expertise. We're seeing that, again, on other aspects of climate change. And more and more issues, we're seeing these hybrid types of organizations that are somewhat new and not like our traditional international organizations. I would not be surprised. We will see. But I would not be surprised if we see some entity that has some of these elements of these kind of new hybrid types of organizations that bring in elements other than public sector to contribute their expertise. But we will see. We will see what they choose to do.
Thank you.
I'm Jane Terry from the Organization of American States, right next door.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this problems of technology evolving so rapidly and international organizations and legal structures and legal agreements moving relatively slowly. And the other is in highly technological issue areas, dealing with the issues of transparency. It's very difficult to understand the principles behind some of the decisions that are made if you're not an internet specialist. I just wondered if you could expand on those two things a little bit.
Indeed, thank you, thank you, indeed, one could have a conversation just about what's going on in the Americas, indeed, in this area. But indeed, there is a challenge. And I was talking earlier about hybrid organizations. There is a challenge for all of our big international organizations, which have absolutely crucial roles. Often have tasks which are whether political, technical, social, otherwise, which are crucial to be done and make only be possible to be done by international organizations. That said, many, or especially the large organizations, are often composed, let's say, often of member states. They would have certain jobs that they've been assigned to do, and that they're organized to accomplish those tasks. It takes a long time to develop a consensus on any issue in their regular line of business. What's often difficult is then to introduce a new issue because it may not be clear who has the authority, who has the legitimacy of the member states to be credible on the topic. But it also may be the case that that no one organization has the expertise because it's a new topic. And it's hard then in large organizations often to take on a new activity. This is true in national governments. This is true in private institutions. It's that moving a large ship is difficult. And so the challenge for, I think, for many international organizations is how do they take on this particular aspect and which element is relevant. So if we look at, just to take the United Nations system and looking at internet issues, that there are different, as we go back to these tasks, there are different aspects just in the, even before you get onto the debate about what role should governments and international organizations play, just within the UN family, there was some question. If you look at this list, something like digital access, UNESCO works on digital access as part of its international communications and technology, but so does the UN Development Program. Now, in my previous life, I gave a speech at UNESCO about UNESCO's role in the WSIS Plus 20 review. But looking at greater access and development, part of that is an issue for education, part of that is a technical issue. Some of the addresses and interoperability, some of that relates to broadcasting frequencies. That's a difficult technical issue. So even trying to figure out which organization within one system is hard. So that's always difficult in international organizations. But then the other aspect you raised was transparency. And here, one's reminded of a challenge I think I see generally as someone who's, as a professor of international affairs looking at this, is that there's a question of the degree of technical knowledge combined with the degree of political insight to international affairs. Because indeed, as you indicate, that understanding enough about the technical engineering point to understand what's important. Which of these decisions is important that actually has a larger issue, a political issue, I think is a challenge. And I think, if we look at how we teach international affairs and how we think about it, one of the issues is how we know enough about the technical issues to be able to talk about the policy issues, and how do people who know about the policy issues know each side know each other well enough. I mean, years ago, and I'm just old enough, I got my PhD in 1989. So the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And although I was not working on nuclear physics, since I worked on transatlantic relations, I had to know enough, and NATO issues and so forth, I had to know enough about nuclear weapons to be able to talk about it. Tomorrow in my class in Emerging Powers, I'm going to be talking about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the role of Brazil and Turkey and others on this issue. You have to know enough about the issue of nuclear weapons to be able to talk about the politics thereof. On this issue, one needs to know enough about it. And this is where I think the importance of interdisciplinary work is so crucial, because I think we need to teach each other. And these sorts of institutions are places where we can do it, so we can begin to be able to understand enough to be able to bring greater transparency to the issue as a whole. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. We can always carry the conversation upstairs to the reception.
Hi, I'm Sam Higginbotham with the International Franchise Association. Do you think that the recent revelations regarding government surveillance will pose any challenges to maintaining the Internet's interoperability? And if so, what form do you think those challenges will take?
Well, it's interesting. I think that you saw initially in 2013, as I mentioned, that you had the already existing issue of management of the technical aspects on the internet and the transition of the INA. That was already an issue before we had the revelations. Because the question was what should be the future model? To what extent should this still be a contract within the U.S. government? That was already a debate. What happened with the surveillance issues and the NSA others was a concern, I think, by many parts of the rest of the world that the advantage the U.S. had on the technical side, that the security agencies were taking advantage of that. I think that became quite heated in 2013, 2014. I think we may have moved a bit along in that debate because I think there's a recognition both we're grappling with those issues here in the United States and trying to look at, again, what are the appropriate mechanisms in a liberal democracy ruled by law for managing surveillance issues. Every government recognizes surveillance is required. Most governments do it, and many governments that were complaining admitted they were surveilling the U.S. and it was, people were throwing stones in glass houses, a bit of that. So, but I think there is a recognition and understanding that you do have to come up with the governance issues that were there before. So I think some of the heat has dissipated and people are trying to focus on seriously about how do you both address the surveillance issues and how you address the internet issues, and I think that those could be untangled more than they were maybe a year ago, and that's where I think many countries are thinking about what's the future they would really like to see. But I think there's a lot of work that still has to be done in that area.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
They must be missing you in the policy world. I think their losses are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Down the hall. Okay, great.
Okay.
For refreshments and
Thank you.
further conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. No, I know it's interesting.